right. Thank you, Jeffrey. Hi, everybody. This is Ali Arjomand here. Great to be online with you on this Friday. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedules. I'm really looking forward to having this presentation and questions later in the talk. Again, thanks for the invitation, Jeffrey, and the Specific Carbohydrate Diet Association for planning this speaker series and inviting me for this session. Now I'm going to give you a slideshow, so I'm just going to switch my screen and pop up my screen and give everybody a little introduction if you don't know me. Today's talk is going to be about identifying and addressing nutrient deficiencies while following the specific carbohydrate diet. And I know this is an important topic and it's been brought up quite a few times. And I'd like to just give you the full perspective of why I think this is not only an important subject, but it's also an addressable subject. Now, if you are new here, this is just a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about, just to set the table for everybody. I'll talk about elimination diets in general, because SCD is considered an elimination diet, but many of you have heard me talk about it being an expansion diet as well. I'll talk about requirements, nutrient requirements in general and in IBD, and then we'll dive into macronutrients, micronutrients, and at the end, we'll talk about some of the tools and resources you'll have to track your progress and your intake of nutrients while following SCD and making sure you're within boundaries of safe limits, both on the low side and on the high side. So before I start, a little bit about me, in case you're new or you haven't heard me talk previously. I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease myself in 2001, although I likely had it for at least a decade prior to that. So I was diagnosed pretty late. And then I, over the subsequent couple of decades, placed on all the approved medications and biologics all the way through Humira. Of course, I was kind of constantly in the hospital due to my condition and obstructions and 2 small bowel resections, all the way through 2017 when Entyvio failed for me and I refused to go on Stelara and instead started SCD for the first time. And that's where I've been ever since. Became quite committed to the diet and an advocate for it as well. I saw immediate results with my fecal calprotectin literally within weeks, and same with CRP, and a year later with colonoscopy and an MRE, where my doctor was also convinced that this is for real. And I've been doing this diet for 5 years, been medication free since then, and happy to dive in and give you all the things I've learned over the years. Some of you may know that I also was invited to present at the 2019 SCD Rocks conference. That was the last time I know we were all together in one room. The video is, of course, available at the website hosted by SCDA. Subsequent to that, I had already changed my career path and my trajectory. Now that I'd seen so much improvement in my own case, is I opened a nutrition clinic here in Seattle to help other IBD patients get going with meaningful diet interventions. And ever since COVID, everything's gone virtual, and I'm now doing telehealth support to anybody across the country. Now, one thing I also did was capture all the information I'd learned about myself, the evidence that I'd put together, and asked Dr. David Susskind, who's at Seattle Children's, also a proponent of SCD, to the patients that he thinks would be appropriate. And together we published this article, this peer-reviewed publication that captures the sequence of events and the intervention, and also the economic impact of being able to succeed on a diet intervention on SCD with IBD. I also produced, to make implementing this SCD easier, I developed an online protocol that's now been available and in use. And also I presented results from 87 IBD patients who had followed this online kind of self-guided protocol at this most recent Crohn's Colitis Congress in front of a lot of other IBD practitioners and doctors and nurses and so on. So the word's getting out, and I'm excited to be part of that mission and that advocacy to at least help patients get more access to diet, to get more confidence about SCD, and to get more collaboration with their doctors and their teams to introduce diet as a core part of their diet. Before all this happened, just in case you don't know, I have a bachelor's degree in genetics and a PhD in nutrition, both from University of California in Davis. And my career has kind of dabbled across a lot of things in global health and medical research, in genomics and biotech and diagnostics. But to me, all of that was irrelevant if the work I was doing wasn't impacting individual people's lives. And that's why I was literally just kind of moved past that, gave that up, and started coming face to face with patients, trying to help have positive impact on their individual daily lives. And so that's where I find myself. This is a fantastic transition for me. So we're here to talk about SCD and how we can optimize it, make sure it becomes a safe and long-term roadmap for our management of IBD. Now, in terms of what the perception of diet in general, I kind of created this little sequence of slides to talk about what I remember as how IBD perceives diet. So back in the 1980s, basically the premise was food has nothing to do with IBD, right? Still the case. A lot of people say that, but this is kind of a long-standing premise. And just to kind of reiterate how long ago this was, I mean, do you guys remember the 1980s? This is sort of maybe a flashback, right? Just to remind you how long ago people have been saying food has nothing to do with IBD, and maybe even longer than that. All right, well, so the 90s came along and the mantra was, well, just eat a low residue diet. That'll take care of things, low residue diets. And, just to remind you what the 90s were like, okay, that's a good snapshot of the 90s, right? Kind of moving forward. And then the next decade, the mantra was, well, diet may have something to do with IBD, but we're not quite sure what that is. So, all right, that's kind of a little snapshot of how things are progressing. And then moving into the next decade, all right, so now SCD becomes a little bit a part of the conversation more, and SCD may be beneficial, but hard to implement. So just do the Mediterranean diet instead, right? And, it's a little bit more of a recent thing. We can remember this. And all the way to the 20s, like where the decade we're in right now. SCD may be effective. It's kind of like part of the conversation, but it may cause nutritional deficiencies. And it's an elimination diet, and it may cause eating disorders. So that's kind of where we are. This transition over time and space is the mental perception of diet has changed quite a lot, and in a good way. It's come a long way, but not far enough, right? And so what we're here to talk about is why there's still resistance to talk about intervention in diet in IBD, why there's a bit of a backlash as far as an elimination diet, and we'll work around it and make it come together. So elimination diets are generally they're used to identify foods that are not tolerated well. We remove them, whatever that intolerated food was, we remove it from the diet until tolerance can be established. And then the idea is to introduce that back in the diet. But in the meantime, while we're eliminating those nutrients, those foods, we may also be eliminating the required nutrients as well. All right, and doesn't matter whether it's a vegetarian diet. This is an elimination diet. Vegetarian diets are elimination diets, obviously. Vegan diets are elimination diets. In general, plant-based diets, low FODMAP, gluten-free, right? You eliminate gluten. Carnivore is a elimination diet, right? EEN, we use this in IBD, the world of IBD. That's an elimination diet. And here we are, SCD. So SCD is not a unique thing in this world in general. And my perspective is that the standard American diet is also an elimination diet. And I'll spell out why I say that. So let's put this in a bigger context. Within the elimination diet world, SCDs kind of sits there along with these other ones. And let's see how it squares up and what gaps it has and how to address them. So, going back to the standard American diet, the recommendations, the government recommendations are published in the dietary guidelines for Americans. It's intended to give a comprehensive overview of what foods to include and make it a complete diet for health, right? So the guidelines include sensible things like focus on whole foods, vary the vegetables. There's a lot of things about grains, which we don't want in SCD, vary or protein, right? Pretty reasonable things in here. So how does it actually play out in the real world? If these are the guidelines, how many Americans actually adhere to the US guidelines, dietary guidelines? Well, this chart spells that out. And there's an index here, and it's basically how well are the compliances or adherence. And you can see it barely crosses 60%, meaning the guidelines are there and almost nobody's, is very, very, the percentage of people following them is low, right? Especially low in the teen years, early adult. And so you could easily say that general population, the public in the US is really not adhering to sensible guidelines, as broad as they may be. And even when you look at them within major food groups, so here are the vegetables. If you look at the horizontal line in the middle, that's kind of the break even. You want to be above that to follow or adhere to the guidelines. You can see in total vegetables, 90% of Americans don't even adhere to the required vegetable guidelines. This is general public adhering to the American guidelines, food guidelines. Green vegetables, orange vegetables, across the board, there's significant shortfall. And that's why I say the standard diet in America ends up being an elimination diet. It's essentially devoid of vegetables, right? Very, very few Americans actually adhere to the number of vegetables required or recommended. Fruits, also significant shortfall. But when we get to the grains, you can see, especially with refined grains, whole grains are extremely underrepresented or non-adhered to, and refined grains are way over the top. So, that's what we're trying to avoid in SCD. And these are, refined flours and everything else you find. So this is the reality that we are in the US. And then you move to dairy and proteins, and it's sort of a mixed bag here, so, sort of a 50-50. Seafood is very low, soy products 50, and so on. So this is just to sort of show you evidence that SCD is a bit not unique in this world of elimination diets. And what Americans typically follow already is poor in diversity and compliance, and is itself devoid of a lot of nutrients. And in IBD, it might be even worse because we may be cutting back a lot of helpful foods, fruits, vegetables before SCD is introduced. So that's kind of a little bit of a background. And unfortunately, going back to the guidelines, it's actually published by the USDA in collaboration with Health and Human Services as a public document. It's really not specific to specific conditions or specific populations. It's also heavily focused on sort of agricultural commodities, so enhancing U.S. agriculture, and doesn't really emphasize the health aspects. So we want to move past this and really customize a diet that is appropriate for the population we're here to talk about, IBD. So how do you really remedy population-wide nutrient deficiencies, like I just showed you, the vegetables, the fibers, and so on? and the nutrients that are embedded in those vegetables, right? How do you remedy it at such a wide scale, across the population? So there are really two ideas you can introduce. One is through education and behavior change, which we know it doesn't really work through public sector. And the other one is fortification. So fortification, right? So what is fortification? Fortification in this case, I'll give you a real world example. In 1998, folic acid fortification of enriched flours, enriched cereal grains started in the US. And it was fully implemented by 1998. It started a few years before that, and it was fully implemented by 1998. And it led to an additional intake of about 100 to 150 micrograms per day of folic acid through these enriched cereal products. Whether you wanted it or not, it was embedded and fortified in the US. And it was actually done, and it was a very effective intervention at reducing the prevalence of this very specific birth defect called spina bifida. Spina bifida is caused by folic acid deficiency in the early days of pregnancy. And this was a very effective fortification to address that gap in the diet. This because of refined grains in the American diet, or it was an eliminated nutrient. It was an elimination of that nutrient. So this was a way to bring it back. And 51 other countries have done the same thing since then. And this is the prevalence of spina bifida as a result, right? So before the intervention, where the arrow is, we've seen an amazing steady decline in rates of this birth defect. This is actually the work I did in graduate school at UC Davis. I worked on folic acid, and some of my research was kind of driven by this spina bifida prevalence. And I feel great. I feel great that this has had such an amazing success. But it is a recognition that the standard food supply is devoid of nutrients, and sometimes you need to fortify it en masse for the whole population to meet its needs. And in fact, FDA has a requirement for an enriched flour to include this many milligrams of thiamine, lysine, folic acid, riboflavin, and even iron to be called enriched, right? So it's sort of, I wouldn't call it cheating, but it's how you address deficiency across large populations, right? You put it in a supply where it's commonly available and embedded in everything from pasta to bread to donuts, and you can address this gap of nutrients in a large population. Now, because SCD eliminates flour, we're not getting the enriched, fortified source of these nutrients. This is pretty important. We'll get into it later in the talk, but each of these nutrients is available in a fortified format to most Americans. It's not available to SCD followers, right? Just by definition, we're not consuming this fortified nutrient or ingredient. Another one, you probably know about this as well, is salt, right? Iodine is required for thyroid hormones. And so iodized salt was very common. It's a powerful public health intervention and has had amazing success in reducing iodine deficiency. Iodized salt is used in SCD, so I'm not really worried about iodine deficiency. However, I have seen patients who come to me who are on their wellness journey, who are doing everything they can, and are only using, let's say, Himalayan salt, right? These sort of mineralized natural sources of salt, because it's kind of popular and healthy sounding and maybe a little trendy as well. And I've actually found a couple of patients who are iodine deficient as a result, because they're not using fortified salt. You don't have to use iodized salt. You can consume or take iodine supplements, but it is something that didn't exist, I don't know, a decade ago, because most people were using iodized salt. So just a couple of things to think about as we go forward in my talk here. There's some funny things going on in terms of within SCD, these fortified nutrients or ingredients may cause gaps, and we need to make sure we address them. So just moving on, what the question is, what is the real elimination diet? And my contention is it's actually the standard American diet is the real elimination diet. We've addressed it through fortification for a few decades, but please don't call SCD an elimination diet in reference or in relationship to the standard American diet. If it's done correctly, SCD is actually an expansion diet. All right, so let's talk about it. We're here to talk about SCD. How do we make SCD a core part of our IBD care plan? And then how do we ramp it up at home so that it becomes part of our routine? How do we work with our GI doctors or our care team so that they're on board, everybody's on board? How do we maintain communication between team members? How do we adjust the diet if needed? And how do we place guardrails if things aren't going right? How do we know it's time to hit pause? So I want to talk a second here about GI doctors and a GI care team in general, because there is a lot of pushback and backlash in our community around working with our GI doctors. I just kind of made up this table, this sort of representation. It's just a supposition. I think, maybe 60% of the GI doctors actively resist SCD and other diets. That's just sort of like, we've seen that, I'm sure. Let's say 20% are indifferent. They just know you're going to come back and be on meds anyway. So they're kind of neutral. Maybe there's 15% who are hopeful that diet SCD works. They're just not really convinced. Maybe you can work with them. And maybe there's 5% of the GI doctors out there that are fully supportive, maybe even recommending it, right? Again, these numbers are totally made up, but it's a good way to start a conversation. So given this, let's see why there is such resistance with the GI doctors to where they may counsel you to stop SCD or not start SCD or stick with your medications. Well, one concern is weight loss, right? They may consider SCD as, again, an elimination diet, poorly adhere to poor in nutrients, poor source of energy, calories, and so it results in weight loss, and so you should not do it, right? So how do we work with that? Well, we can track and manage the weight. So this is going to be part of the conversation today, is how do we ensure that the right amount of energy and it comes in from the diet to manage our weight, maintain weight within safe range, and we can satisfy any concerns people may have around weight loss. This is also important in pediatrics, of course, because it's not just weight, but it's also growth, right? Stature, growth, thriving, and all that. And this is more of a, multi-month, 6-month, 1-year time frame. So we'll talk about that. GI doctors may be concerned about malnutrition. Well, your weight's stable, but you're not getting the right nutrients. You're not getting the variety of vitamins and so on. How do we address that? Well, same thing. We can track and manage signs of malnutrition. We'll talk about that and make sure that everybody's satisfied that all essential nutrients are present and meeting our needs. GI doctors may be concerned that you're doing this sort of weird diet intervention, unsupervised, on your own, and who knows what's going to happen. Well, I'm a little bit biased here, but I think you should tell them that you're working with somebody who knows what they're doing, or who's an expert, who's kind of knows the ins and outs of all this. Whether it's a dietitian who's trained in SCD and has the time to walk you through it, very, very important, or any other expert that you may be able to tap into so that you're not guessing or guiding your own way through this. And then visibility, right? The doctor may not have any clue what you're doing. So it's important to establish a regular communication plan, keep it coordinated, and let your doctor know that what you're eating, what stage of SCD you're at, and what your weight is, and how you're feeling. And that will definitely open up the visibility and essentially trust, right? Two-way trust is very, very important. And I think those are really important things to think about as you think about working with your GI team, so that they're comfortable with what you're doing, you're comfortable with what they're doing, and everybody moves forward together. All right, so now let's talk about it. Let's really get into it. What we really want to talk about is nutrients. So what is the definition? Nutrient is a substance or ingredient that promotes growth, provides energy, and maintains life, right? So it's pretty basic. We know this. An essential nutrient cannot be produced by the body or cannot be produced in sufficient amounts. And so it must be obtained through other means. So we're really here to talk about not just nutrients, but essential nutrients, because we cannot make them or we cannot make them enough. So think about vitamin D. You can make vitamin D if you go out in the sun, but you cannot make enough. So you need to find other sources for it. So you'll see that theme throughout this talk. So if that's nutrient, then what's a diet? So diet is really where you get these essential nutrients, right? Essentially, that's kind of what we're talking about. And when the diet doesn't supply that, we have to get them from other places. But diet is a place where we get our essential nutrients. It's also serves as a social, cultural, emotional, culinary, and all these other non-nutritive functions. So let's not just be scientific and sort of technical about this. We know diet is an important parameter in all these things. And we want SCD to satisfy all those needs as much as possible, right? So it's got to taste good. It's got to have some emotional value. It's you don't want to be eating alone when everybody else is eating other ways. So these are complex questions and issues to address. But if it's driving you to shortcut your nutrient intake, then that's not a good thing. And it may not have anything to do with SCD itself. It may have something to do with these other aspects, emotional, social, and otherwise. So this is a little bit of a more wider conversation. All right, so really the question is, how much essential nutrient do I need, right? That's a pretty basic question to ask. And how do I know I'm under or over, right? This is kind of an essential starting point to making sure everything's in check. So let's talk about that. How much do I need, right? This is a very, very basic question. And it sort of has two answers. One answer is, well, there's a certain amount you need to prevent disease, right? With any nutrient, think of how much you may need to prevent a specific disease. There's also an amount to support optimal health. And those are two different numbers. In fact, when you see a range for a nutrient, it's always kind of a lower and an upper end. And the lower end is meant to convey how much nutrient you need to prevent disease, which is very different than the upper end, which is meant to support optimal health. The number that's supposed to be sort of like preventing disease is a public health measure, public health number, reducing spina bifida in the population, right? Reducing scurvy in the population, those very, very big scale things. Has no relevance to you as a person who wants to be, of course, not diseased, but also optimal. So you should really focus on the upper end of things. And when you factor in growth needs in pediatrics, pregnancy, of course, lactation, any kind of disease state that increases your requirements for nutrients, any injury that requires recovery and repair, and athletic activity, all of these drive intake and drive demand. And so you should absolutely be on the upper end of the scale, right? So that's point number one, is to think of your own individual needs and then see if you're addressing them. Now, how much is that? So let's really get down into it. There's really three different ways of finding out how much you really need, three different approaches to calculating this. Now, one of them is to, I'll just call it replace what you lose. So this is how it works. You capture all your nutrient losses. Let's say you collect your urine and stool where your nutrients leave your body. You measure how much comes out in those losses. You double that just as a safety factor, and you replace it in your diet, right? So you just collect what you lose, double it, and then take twice as much in your diet. That's actually how RDIs are calculated. This is one way the health authorities, the researchers do this kind of research. Another way is you study two different populations. One actually has a disease, let's say anemia or condition that's deficient, osteoporosis, and so on. And you assess that population's intake of various nutrients. And then you may discover that the people with osteoporosis have low calcium intake, let's say, and then you use that as an indicator or evidence to increase calcium intake, right? So you match the intake of the people who don't have osteoporosis. So this is more of an epidemiologic population level approach. So both approaches are used and both are valid. And usually you want them to come up with the same number, right? Roughly. Now, I sort of invented or kind of came up with this third way. I didn't really invent it. It's just sort of like a fun way to approach it. And it's basically asking yourself if that nutrient is storable or not, right? So it's kind of a new way of thinking about it. Is the nutrient stored in the body? If so, how much? And then you can plan around your intake based on how much you can reserve or store up, right? So let's think about that as just a concept. It's not really used in the nutrition field a lot, really, but it's kind of a good way to have this conversation. So I'll use that going forward. Now, why is that important? Well, think of your body as a compartment. So this little jar here, think of it as your body, and your nutrient intake is basically coming in and your losses are coming out, right? It's kind of like that. And you have a certain reserve of that nutrient in your body. This is happening every day, and the losses are lost in urine, lost in stool, it's metabolized, it's destroyed. Of course, you don't retain everything forever. There is one exception, that's iron. But this is how it works, right? This is your body's compartment. Now, you may have some nutrient that you have low reserves, right? You're kind of basically spent. There's really nothing on tap, really, in the reserves. And sometimes you're in a state where you have high reserves. And these are really, really important because they determine how resilient you are in your intake, in any deficiency you may have, because you can tap into your reserves, right? Pretty simple concept. Now, in IBD, what happens is not only is this picture hold true, but you have issues with intake, right? So intake is typically lower because maybe your appetite is lower. Your food, actually, the quantity of food you take is lower. The diversity of your food is not so good, perhaps. Your absorption of nutrients isn't optimal because you have inflammation in the small intestine. You may have had a resection where a portion of your intestines are surgically removed, and you may be on medications, right? All of these will impact the net intake of nutrients coming in. So instead of a big drop, it basically becomes a little drop. And so on the front end, the intake's diminished. On the loss side, it actually goes up because your body's doing a lot of work. There's demand has gone up. There's repair happening. There's work to be done. There's metabolism. There's a lot of stuff happening. Your immune system's on overdrive. And so your demand for nutrients goes up, and also your losses go up, whether it's additional diarrhea or bleeding or other things. So the net is that in IBD, in general, your intake is less and your losses are higher. So we got to remedy this. We're going to remedy this by making sure that as much as possible, losses are managed, but we can't really control that so much. But we can control the intake. We can focus on ensuring that even with a not perfect appetite, we are consuming enough food and the right diversity and having address any issues that might be limiting us. So with that, let's dive in and talk about the actual kind of breakdown. So macronutrients, I'm sure you know what they are. You may think there are 3 macronutrients, and you're right. But for the sake of this conversation, I like to expand that to 6 macronutrients. And some of it is just for fun, but some of it is to make a point. All right. So what are they? All right. So remember what the nutrient is. It's essential for your body to grow. Well, let's just for a second here consider oxygen as a macronutrient, right? And I'll come back to this in a second. Water, right? Water, you cannot survive without water. We'll consider that as a macronutrient. Protein, the one you probably already thought is a macronutrient. Fat and carbs, right? The 3 you probably already thought, they're in there. And then let's add fiber in there as well. Okay, fiber behaves a little differently than carbohydrates. So let's talk about each of these individually and how they are part of your diet and how they're part of your SCD. Oxygen is a little bit of a standout, but let's talk about it. So how does oxygen work? Well, the body actually senses oxygen levels in your bloodstream, right? There's low levels of oxygen, or it's called hypoxia. As soon as that happens, your body automatically responds by increasing your breathing. And then oxygen is replenished from the surrounding air. You don't even have to think about it. And it's maintained within a safe upper and lower range, right? There's certain parts of your brain and sensors in your respiratory tract, your bloodstream, that monitor oxygen and tell your brain to tell your lungs to step it up, to start breathing faster. And it's all done autonomously, and we don't even think about it. And because oxygen is everywhere, we don't have to go seek it, right? It's just pretty much available. But this is an example of we'll use in all the other macronutrients. Like, how do we know we've had enough? How does our body know it's had enough? And how does it maintain this safe upper and lower range? Now, you may have one of these little oxygen sensors at home, and it's exactly how your brain works, but it's doing it all the time, 24 hours a day. Now, in terms of storage, oxygen cannot be stored. Remember, I asked you, ask if a nutrient can be stored or not. Oxygen cannot be stored for more than a few minutes of needs, right? Your hemoglobin can pick it up, right? Your hemoglobin binds up oxygen and circulates it. And your myoglobin in your muscles also pick it up and store it for local muscular needs. But within a few seconds of muscle activity, they run out, right? That's that burning feeling you get when you run a couple of flights of stairs. So oxygen certainly cannot be stored, and that's why we need it every second, every few minutes, right? Yeah, just try going up the stairs or holding your breath. You won't be able to. This autonomous control system takes over. Now, interestingly, while we're on the subject, this guy here, Budimir Sobat, last year broke the breath holding record and got the Guinness Book of Records. For 24 minutes, 37 seconds, he held his breath. He did it by just decreasing demand. Like, he wasn't breathing, but he just kind of shut his systems down as much as possible so that he could make it this long. Now, we don't want to do that with nutrient deficiency. We don't want to have shut systems down to make it through a deficient period. So I thought that would be kind of a fun thing to present. So let's talk about water. Right now, we're talking about actual nutrients from the diet. let's see, a 70 kilogram person has, we're mostly water, 42 liters of water, and it's primarily lost through the urine. The kidneys do all that work, but it's also lost through feces, also sweat, and actually quite a bit through lungs, right? The breathing. So naturally, we need to replace it. And there's an indirect control system that monitors water through these osmoreceptors that, again, talk to the brain and tell the brain that we're getting a little bit low on water. It generates a sensation of thirst. This is involuntary. It drives you to go drink like an animal, right? It's the animal part of your brain. It also produces a hormone that tells the kidneys to preserve the water it has. Like, let's not lose more urine if we can hold on to it. So there's a very tightly controlled process for monitoring and managing water loss so that you stay within a normal range. Now, this is important because water is not storable. Again, we're thinking about storage here. Of course, you can store a little bit, but not much. So how much do we actually need as humans? Well, there actually are no hard rules, although you see a lot of targets talking about 6 to 8 glasses of water. It's really not backed by science. A lot of it comes from the bottled water and sports drink manufacturers. They've kind of hyped up hydration more than it actually deserves to obviously kind of make you want to go buy their products, right? But your body naturally has a very tightly controlled, very powerful system to monitor and drive you to drink. What I'd recommend is just having water nearby within arm's reach, and let your body run the show, right? When it's thirsty, it will grab some and it will drink it, and it will reach its needs that way. So listen to your body. Of course, pay extra attention if you're vomiting, if you have diarrhea issues. Electrolytes are an important thing I'll talk about in a second. The other thing you may want to do is just kind of look at your urine. And typically, if it's a little darker looking, it might be a sign that there's a little bit of dehydration. All right. Now, inside SCD, how does SCD treat water or liquids? So SCD eliminates consumption of non-nutritive beverages, which is good, right? Soda, sports drinks, beer, fruit juices that have basically the fiber removed. We don't want those in SCD. So it encourages abundant intake of water, tea, coffee, dry wines are fine. Distilled spirits are typically fine, but they're not really a source of water. It's just alcohol. So yeah, it's pretty self-embedded and clear-cut. It should be very, very easy to manage. Hydration inside SCD, as long as you kind of keep access to it. And don't forget, food itself is a substantial source of water. For example, lettuce is 95% water, right? Now, you're not drinking lots of or eating lots of lettuce, but don't forget that there is a fairly substantial amount of water in food. So keep that in your tallies if you're doing that. All right, let's switch to proteins, right? We're moving through the macronutrients, and this is now starting to get some serious things here. So protein is an important subject. I'll spend some time on it. So first of all, proteins, what are they? Well, your body makes enzymes from the protein it gets from the diet. These enzymes drive reactions that would not be possible otherwise. So you're here because you have enzymes that can do things that wouldn't be possible, right? Structural proteins, muscle, skin, tissues, right? Those are all protein. They also serve as biochemical needs. So neurotransmitters and hormones, energy. Protein can serve as a fuel when you need it, right? You may not need it ideally, but when you do, it can kind of be your backup fuel. Yeah, and nitrogen is the key nutrient here. So just like most plants, we cannot extract nitrogen from the atmosphere. Nitrogen is essential, and we cannot get it from the atmosphere, even though 80% of the atmosphere is nitrogen. Plants get their nitrogen through fertilizer, right? We need protein. That's where we get our nitrogen. Now, there is an exception. Legumes have their own root microbes, and they help pull nitrogen out of the air. That's why legumes are pretty amazing. But nitrogen can also be poisonous if it's not excreted as a toxin, right? So urea is a way your body gets rid of nitrogen when it's all spent. And so we want to make sure we keep our kidneys happy and healthy so that not only hydration is important, but they manage the nitrogen balance, right? Now, just digging into a little bit more, you probably know all this. 20 amino acids make up all the proteins. 9 can be made by you, but 11 need to come from the diet. These are the essential amino acids. We need them from the diet. Most animal protein sources are the best way to get these essential amino acids. So meat, eggs, poultry, fish, right? These have all the essential amino acids in sufficient amount to meet your body's needs. Plant foods, on the other hand, have an incomplete profile of these essential amino acids. So soy products, beans, nuts, and certain grains aren't going to satisfy your body's needs for these essential amino acids. Now, a vegetarian or a vegan can get all the essential amino acids they need. They just need to eat a lot of their food. So they need to eat large volume of food, of these vegan foods or vegetarian foods. They need to have a healthy appetite, and they need to have a really good, healthy gut, right? Good digestive capacity, good absorptive capacity, so that they can make up for the shortfall of some amino acids in some plants, so that eventually when they eat enough of it, they'll get to where they need to go. Well, we don't want to really push our luck. And with IBD, we don't have the luck of being able to eat a lot when we're not healthy. So naturally, animal-based products are the best way to get all our amino acids, all our essential amino acids, much more digestible, much more nutrient rich. Now, of course, protein, funny enough, cannot be stored, right? If we could, we just eat a bunch of protein and suddenly grow muscles, and it doesn't work that way. So we want to make sure that we're eating sufficient protein so that our bodies can continue to maintain the muscles that they have, and we don't lose the muscles, basically break them down as a source of amino acids that we need in other parts of our body. So it's called sarcopenia when you lose body muscle, and it's a really bad sign. If you start losing body muscle, skeletal muscle, you get weakness, other dysfunctions. It's a really, really important sign of decline and ill health and frailty, right? And high risk of early death, actually. So building up muscles early in life and maintaining them throughout life is really key. And having sufficient protein in the diet is the first step of maintaining muscle. Having physical activity and using those muscles is the second step. So how much is enough? Well, the federal guidelines, recommended dietary allowance, requires just 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And this is very low, right? Remember, it's just to prevent disease. It's on that low end of that range, meets basic nutritional requirements from getting sick, and it's not at all what is needed for optimal health. So be very, very careful at calculating how much protein you need. So let's take a closer look. So I created this table using basically the formula that is in the RDA for protein. So just look up your body weight on the green column, under pounds or kilograms. I'll just use 150 as an example. So if I weigh 150 pounds, I'm 68 kilograms. And so the RDA for me would be 55 grams of protein per day. That would prevent me from getting sick. And if I have that, everybody's happy, right? Well, a few things. One, it doesn't really define what kind of protein. Like, is that 55 grams of soy protein, or is it, chicken, right? Huge difference in terms of the quality of that protein, the digestibility of that protein, and how much my body can actually assimilate and use for its needs. So it's woefully low and absent of any characteristics of the quality. So instead of using a 0.8 multiplier, remember, look at the very top, takes your kilograms and multiplies it by 0.8. That's how the RDA is calculated. 150 pounds is 68 kilograms times 0.8 is 55 grams of protein. Again, very low. So I generated this table with higher and higher multipliers, all the way to 2.0, right? So 1.2, again, looking at that example of a 150-pound person, their required intake goes from 55 grams on the low end to 136 grams on the high end, almost 3 times as much. So pretty wide range. What do we do? My recommendation is to definitely stay away from the 0.8 range for sure. Something around 1.4 multiplier is a safe and reliable estimate, right? So again, going back to this example, a 150-pound person would need 95 grams of protein minimum. This is not the upper range anymore. This is, to meet your requirement. And it's not even factoring in what we talked about earlier: growth, pregnancy, lactation, disease, athletics, injury. So, you may want to go to 1.6 even, or 1.8 multiplier. Pregnancy for sure, right? So use this table to determine, and if you're, outside the range of this scale, you can calculate your own way. But this is a very, very important way of determining protein intake. And with SCD, because it does focus on a lot of animal proteins initially and more sources of those, shouldn't be too hard to get there. All right, so for example, these are SCD sources of protein. I've ranked here from high to low, and by low, I mean 0. So at the top, chicken, lamb, turkey, these are excellent, essentially super high sources of protein. We know this, right? Pretty self-explanatory. In the middle, you've got some legumes and lentils, which you may or may not tolerate, even though they're SCD compatible. Just keep going. These are per gram of weight of the product, all the way to the right side, which is now kind of really the vegetables and fruits and not so much protein at all the way to the last item, which is just, olive oil and honey, which are definitely not sources of protein. Spices, not sources of protein. So I just wanted to give you that range. And if any of you know the my SCD protocol that I created to help navigate and introduce and progress through SCD, this is a screenshot of a typical meal that is in the protocol as a reference, as just a suggestion. This happens to be stage 2, which is the reintroduction of ingredients. It's stage 2B. So there's stage 2A, stage 2B, and 2C. And by then you've reintroduced most of the SCD ingredients back into your diet. In this snapshot, you can see some good sources of protein, right? Smoked salmon, egg cups, they're in there. Beef, chicken, yogurt, right? There's quite a lot of sources of protein here. That QR code can give you, takes you to the page. You can read more about it. But I also quantify how much protein we just looked at. So again, I have a couple of weeks of meal references just to give you a little sense of how to do SCD at this stage. But the protein adds up to about 110 grams on Monday here if you eat all those foods. Again, this is just sort of reference. So yeah, we're getting easily 80, 90, 100, 110 grams of protein with SCD at this stage of the game. And if you're eating that much volume, you should be able to get your protein intake sufficiently to meet your needs, and most of it's coming from animal sources. So perfect. As long as you are keeping a focus on protein, I don't see why SCD should be a challenge for you, right? In fact, it's the other diets, standard American diets with a lot of flour and sugar that struggles to meet protein requirements. So this is a really important nutrient to focus on. I really want to spend some time on it. There's often a shortfall if you're not eating animal products. So plant-based folks, vegetarians, are really going to struggle with meeting protein intake, getting it to the right level. Cooking definitely helps pre-digest or pre-cook the protein, whether it's animal or plant. It's important to chew and salivate because we want those amino acids to break off the protein. That's the digestion. We want to have a good acid production in the stomach. That's an important part of protein digestion. And if we need to, we'll use digestive enzymes to help maximally break down protein so that all the amino acids are released. Some proteins do not break down. Those are usually plant proteins, gluten, soy, corn proteins. They typically do not break down very well. That's why they are lower quality. And in my mind, that's why people have reactions to gluten and so on. They're actually kind of immune triggers. So stick with animal proteins. It's kind of the rule of thumb. Yeah, I just mentioned about gluten and soy. And SCD talks about making bone broth and using a little bit of vinegar to help dissolve the collagen, and excellent source of protein. It's, better than just the chicken juice. It's the actual dissolved collagen coming off the bones. So what if we cannot eat this much protein? Maybe your appetite is poor, or you just can't eat, 2 eggs, 3 eggs a day. I don't know, right? And it gets a little boring having chicken every meal. You may not like fish, or you may not tolerate eggs. You may not tolerate dairy and yogurt. So there's all sorts of reasons you may not be able to fully adhere to this much protein. And so what do you do? So supplement it, right? When you cannot consume or get it through food, my recommendation is to get it from, of course, these external sources. Gelatin, we already know, is part of SCD. People have come up with this ways to introduce beef gelatin. It's usually the source. Easily adds 20 grams, let's say, per day of protein. Nowadays, you can just buy powdered collagen as intact collagen or collagen peptides. The intact will sort of gelify. The peptides will not gelify. I recommend just getting the peptides. They're easier to absorb. If you don't want to do collagen, there's 2 different main categories of collagen. There's sort of beef and also marine, like fish sources. And you can get both. Both are just fine. Pea protein is a plant-based source of protein. So if you can tolerate it, that's great. I would avoid whey and casein-based products, and typically 20 grams per day, maybe for an adult, 10 grams for pediatrics. Under rare circumstances, you probably go up on that, but you don't want to make this your mainstay. You want to move to foods as a source of your protein as soon as you can. All right, so that's protein. Let's talk about fats. So fat functions as many sources. Source of fuel, of course, right? And also as insulation, prevents colds and bumps. So look for bruising, maybe as a sign of loss of fat. There's also a lot of hormonal functions. Is fat storable? This one is, right? Not like protein. This one almost unlimited. amount of storage available. So a typical person will have 200,000 calories of fat stored in them. So extra carbohydrates, extra protein can also be stored as fat. So we have months of storage of energy as fat. Are they essential? In practice, no, but we cannot get our total fuel or energy without fat. And some fats are essential. I've listed them here. These are those omega anti-inflammatory oils. And we also need dietary fat to absorb fat-soluble vitamins. So fats are, a key part of the diet. We want them, we need them, enjoy them. There's plant sources, animal sources, saturated. We've heard about all this stuff. Turns out that saturated fat that kind of used to get a bad rap is not bad at all. The risk with cardiovascular disease or raising cholesterol or LDL is not valid. The science has been debunked in a way. So don't have fear. Enjoy saturated sources of fat, whether it's eggs or dairy or beef. Trying to introduce variety, of course, and salmon and fish would be great alternatives. And then plant sources as well down the road, like coconut oils and so on. Butter would be fantastic. So this is really good. Enjoy it. How much do you actually need? Well, again, there's no hard rules, but on the bottom here, I calculated for a 2,000 calorie diet, roughly how much grams of fat would meet your needs, right? If it's 33% of your total calories, it's 74 grams of fat or 112. Okay. And again, looking at that meal reference from my SCD protocol, we're getting, in the high 80s, 90s grams of fat, which is fantastic. Like lots of good calories, lots of good sources of fat. In SCD, of course, we enjoy eggs, animal sources, like I talked about. You can always increase olive oil and use butter liberally. If you have a gallbladder surgery, we will have issues because of bile insufficiency and lipase insufficiency. So that causes a reduced ability to absorb fat. Be careful there. You'll end up with diarrhea possibly, or fat loss in your stool. So we'll have to address that with supplements and just kind of pay attention to that overall picture there. But fats are generally a easy one to address and an enjoyable source of calories, right? And here are some examples with SCD. All these are SCD compatible ingredients and good sources of fats. All right, moving on to carbohydrates. It's currently the most controversial macronutrient overall in the nutrition community. We're starting to get past our obsession with fat as the bad nutrient. It's moving slowly, but it's there. Now there's a little bit more focus on carbs. And so the question is, are carbs storable? Well, only to a limited degree. We can only store about 2,000 calories worth of carbohydrates in our liver as glycogen and in our muscle as glycogen. And that's enough to just last a few hours of exercise, like a 2-hour run, and it's already depleted. So we need to get carbohydrates to stock that up. But beyond that, we don't really need it. Anything more might be stored as fat. It has to. There's no other way to store it. So inside SCD, of course, specific carbohydrate diet focuses a lot on carbohydrates. I won't get into it too much, but SCD is not a low carb diet. It's also not a high carb diet like the standard American diet. I think it's actually a very good middle ground in terms of the type of carbohydrates, certainly, and the amount. Of course, it avoids sugars, which can overwhelm the digestive capacity. It reduces insulin risk because we're not consuming glucose in sugary drinks and starchy foods and high fructose corn syrup. So all those are driving you towards good health and focusing on the monosaccharides like honey and fruit. So these are good sources of carbohydrates inside SCD. Enjoy them. you're not going to hit an upper limit because we're just avoiding sugar and sodas and high fructose corn syrups, right? So technically not a requirement in the diet, although in practice, about 100 grams is probably the minimum you're going to need, and definitely no more than 400, right? That's way up on the high end. Carbohydrates have a value of inducing insulin, which is an anabolically growth driving hormone. So if you really cut your carbohydrates down, you cut down insulin production. Insulin is not released in your bloodstream, and it's really hard to grow, like put on weight. So if you're having a really tough time growing or gaining weight, it's probably, the loss of insulin and that anabolic factor that goes with it. So I've listed some of the more high carbohydrate rich sources of ingredients in SCD. Obviously not animal. Here are fruits mostly, right? All right, and then I'll just pull up another snapshot of that SCD reference meal week. And here we're hovering around 100, 120, 130 grams of carbohydrates. I think that's a perfect range for a 2,000 calorie typical diet. All right, so given that we just talked about calories and fat and protein, it really comes down to overall energy balance, right? Calories. This is a key one. And a lot of times we're, maybe losing weight and we just want to make sure we're getting enough calories. So Mayo Clinic has a kind of a cool online calorie calculator. You can just QR code it here or just go to their website. And you basically just type in your age, height, weight, and it gives you a rough estimate of your total calorie intake, which may be on the low end because it doesn't factor in what you're dealing with as IBD. So be careful if you're using this calculator for pediatrics and other sources, it's probably going to be underestimated. But if you do that, now we can calculate basically what our food makeup should be energy-wise. So define your protein and calorie targets. Remember, the protein came from that table, the 0.8, 1.2, 1.4 multiplier table. So let's say my protein intake is 150 grams. And I just calculated my calorie target with that calculator I just showed you. Again, it's probably underestimating, but that's fine. And then you got to mix it up with, get that from carbohydrates, fats, and so on. So here's a kind of a 33, 1/3 mix of fat, protein, and carbs to meet your total calorie requirement. I'm sure you can calculate that. That's not a bad starting point. If you want to bump up your protein to 40% at the expense of carbs a little bit here, that's fine. That's actually good. That might be what you need to get to your protein intake. And then if you want to bump up your calorie intake to drive up calorie, then you, again, at the expense of carbohydrates, go up on the fats, right? I don't recommend going below 15% carbs as a source of calories. That's way too low. So, hover around 15 to 20% on the low end. All right. So use this as just sort of like a template. Again, it's not prescriptive or, set in stone, but it gives you sort of a range of percentages to work with. You've already calculated your calorie. You've already calculated your protein target. And then from that, you can come up with the fat and carbs. All right. Again, I just want to pull up the composition of my SCD protocol, where things land. It's a little bit heavy on the fat to get the calories up. Proteins and carbs are in that 30% roughly range, 25, 22, 25. You can see how it plays out. Of course, everybody's going to adjust this and work to meet your own needs and your own preferences. So having supervised, somebody watch over you is very, very important. Here's an actual patient of mine who logged her intake for a couple of days each month over the last, almost year. And initially she was low on on protein, you know, hovering around 50 grams a day. And I worked with her to get closer to 75, 78, 80 grams. And she held it for a whole year, you know, for the rest of that year. And same with fat, was a little bit low. The calories were low. So we bumped up the calories from fat. And those two were enough to sort of bring her up to speed, get her protein and gain some weight. So this is kind of an important tool to watch and track, right? It's not perfect, but it's a good way to deal with it. Okay. All right, moving on to fiber, and then we'll quickly talk about micronutrients. So fiber is not storable, right? It just doesn't even get absorbed. How could you store it? So you should have it every day. Your microbes need it for the ecology that we need. And it's a key part of SCD. It's a key part of the expansion of the diet. And that's why I don't consider it an elimination diet. It actually expands and extends the sources of fiber in a typical IBD patient's routine. Average US intake is about 15 grams per day. And what we want to do is get to about 25 grams. That's a good starting point. If we can get there, that's great. Above 30 would be even better, right? It's kind of like there's a benefit to that. Here are typical intakes of fiber in the current American diet in male and females. This is per 1,000 calories. So double it if you're eating 2,000 calories. So that's where you get that 15 grams. And in SCD, you know, like I said, it drives up fiber intake. Maybe UC can get up there faster than CD patients, Crohn's patients. And it's imperative for healing, right? Very, very important. And at any point, you can try this challenge to not just increase the amount of fiber, but increase the diversity of fiber, like where it's coming from. So ask yourself, how many plants did you eat yesterday, right? So let's say you had a cucumber and a tomato, well, that's 2. And you had some cinnamon, well, that's 3, right? It doesn't matter how much, as long as it's a plant, it counts. So yeah, see if you can get to 10, right? 10 different sources of fiber of plants. See if you can get to 15 over a 1 week span. That's the direction you want to go. That's the process of diversifying your fiber sources, which necessarily diversifies your microbial strains in your gut, which we know is beneficial, right? So it's almost no upper limit. And with different seasons, try different fruits and vegetables that come into season. It's spring right now, so enjoy what you can get. Now, here I have actually pulled up a week example, a 1 week's example of what you would be consuming in a stage 1 of my SCD protocol. This is elimination. So we've cut back on a lot of fibers, right? Remember? And so the fiber intake is on the low side, right? You may think this is quite high actually, but it's still on the low side because we're in the elimination stage, right? The intro stage of SCD. And the following stage, stage 2B, after that, suddenly goes to 19, 18, 20, right? That's what we want to see is start low during the elimination and then go to 20 and 25 and so on. So that's how I want you to think about it. All right, just got a little bit of time left. So I'm going to fairly quickly go through the micronutrients and then wrap it up. Here is a really cool chart of everything that's in your bloodstream, basically things that are measured for clinical reasons. And I'll zoom in on a second, but it's basically got things on the low concentration, things that are present in your bloodstream at low levels. All these ones are hormones. We don't need a lot of them. They're very, very kind of potent. And then as you move to the higher end of the scale, you'll see some of the vitamins, B12 and B9 and folate. And then you keep going to the higher end, you see vitamin C and iron and cholesterol, right? Like triglycerides. And way on the high end, you see hemoglobin and albumin, right? So this is pretty cool. And it represents about a billion-fold difference from the high to low. So some things in your bloodstream are there at 1/1000th the level of other things. And I say this because we're going to be measuring some of these things as an assessment tool to see if you have enough of that vitamin. And it's not so easy, right? So let's pick on iron as a very, very important one. I'll talk about this and then expand to the other ones. Iron is one of those nutrients. A lot of these are storable. They're stored in the liver. You do not need to consume it every day, but if you don't consume it over a period of time, your liver is going to run out. So from the liver, it's distributed to the parts of your body that need it, and it's used, the protein that does that is called transferrin. And then you lose iron through bleeding, right? There's really no other way your body loses it. Maybe a little bit through skin when you donate blood, all right, and menstrual losses. So typically you do not lose iron other than these sort of slow losing exit points. But with GI bleeding, you definitely might be losing a lot of your stores of iron. So be very careful. And typically anemia is what happens, right? So we need iron for hemoglobin synthesis, which is important for mitochondrial production. Anemia is very common in IBD. And the challenge is that iron is really tough to absorb. It's notoriously hard for anybody to absorb iron, let alone IBD patients. So it's best from animal sources, as is often the case, and worse from plants. Even supplements are bad, right? When you do have it with a vitamin C, it definitely helps. So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. And when you have it with grains, which we don't care in SCD, it makes it worse. Like the grains bind it up. So assessing iron status, I'm sure all of you have labs that assess these numbers. And each of these is valid and critical way of assessing your iron reserves. RBC count, hemoglobin, hematocrit, all these are measuring a different part of your function of iron. What I like to do is get it through foods, right? That's the most effective way if you have a healthy gut, if you're not in a flare. I don't think this is for everybody, but if you can get chicken liver and just saute it or grill it, have put a little bit of lemon juice on it for that vitamin C and have it a couple of times a month, you're never going to be low on iron. Okay. It's just very potent, very effective, but you kind of got to enjoy it too. So supplementation is your next best bet. I'll talk about that in a second. A lot of us have had to have iron infusion, just kind of get it right in our bloodstream because it's hard to absorb through the gut. But when you do have the infusion, don't expect your RBC, red bloods, and hematocrit to bounce back. It takes at least a couple of months because the red blood cells have a long lifespan. They turn over slowly. And of course, there's blood transfusion, which gives you the blood, cells itself. And hopefully you won't need that, but I'm sure sometimes we have to go there. Don't forget red blood cell production also needs not just iron, but B12, folate, and good, status with protein. Protein intake should be good. So a lot of times people forget this. They just focus on the iron. Make sure your B12 is in good shape. Make sure your folate is in good shape, and you're getting sufficient protein. And all of that makes your red blood cells. All right, so here's a snapshot of how to look at iron, right? Risk factors, if you have active GI inflammation, GI bleeding, or you're not even eating enough as a vegetarian or vegan. Those are the signs of iron deficiency, whether you're doing SCD or not, right? This is for everybody. Anemia, fatigue, like hair loss, all these things. In terms of lab assessments, you're gonna get these probably from your GI clinic, all right, or any kind of primary care. So get them, monitor them, see if you can get SCD foods to replenish the iron. And if you can't, those are the supplementations that are kind of generically recommended. I want to emphasize, this is kind of a generic recommendation. you're going to have to kind of test it out or talk with your care provider and make sure you're doing it right. But there's a way to do this. Okay, let's talk about the next one, calcium. I just have the snapshot here. We don't have time to go through it in too much detail, but calcium is another big one with IBD. Risk factors: small bowel inflammation, low vitamin D. If you've used prednisone for a period of time, steroids, right? And if you're on a dairy-free diet, those are cause for concern. Like, watch out. If you've got brittle bones or cramps in your muscles, those are signs you're already probably deficient. You know, better get on it. Don't use serum calcium as a lab assessment. It's not accurate. You need a bone density to give you a clear picture of your calcium and bone density. Foods I've listed here: bone broth, shellfish, yogurt. Of course, dairy is going to be good. And then supplementation if you need it, right? For different age groups. It's not ideal. It's not perfect. The absorption is pretty low, but if you stick with it, it will increase your calcium status over time. Okay, so those are two common ones. Here's vitamin D. You can see the risk factors, chronic prednisone use, and so on. Signs that you're becoming deficient are fatigue, muscle pain, bone pain, weakened immune system, very important nowadays on the immune side. A lot of talk about that. Valid lab tests, anything below 20 nanograms per mil, definitely deficient. Try and get to at least 30, right? And is actually beneficial if you get higher than 30 nanograms per mil. And this is a pretty common test, not too expensive, just get it and work your way up with supplementation. Typically hard to get there without it. Okay, we're almost to the end. Here is vitamin B12, another important one. You can see all the risk factors that put you at high risk of being deficient, right? And the signs as well, signs that you're already on the decline. You've become too deficient, right? There are a few valid lab tests that measure this. They're listed here. Again, pretty common. Your doctor can probably order it. And some good sources of SCD foods to replenish you with B12. Typically, if you've had a resection, a terminal ileum resection, you're going to need some kind of sublingual source, which isn't bad at all. Just kind of do it under the tongue and you'll easily get your requirement, or you may need it through shots, intramuscular shots. Your doctor will be able to support you on that. Okay, vitamin C. Now we're getting to the water solubles here. Won't go through everything here. You can see the signs of deficiency, the sources of SCD foods that have high vitamin C. There's a lot of them, a lot of vegetables, excellent sources, citrus, excellent source, and you may still need supplementation. Measuring it in a lab test, somewhat reliable, but again, it's just in your plasma and your serum circulating, which may or may not be reflective of long-term status. So if you have, I don't know, orange juice the day before, it may artificially look good in your bloodstream the next day. So be somewhat suspect. And I would prefer to look at your diet intake as a much more relevant assessment tool rather than a lab test, because it may be kind of missing the longer picture. Here's folate, another very important nutrient. Water soluble, can be inhibited if you're on methotrexate or sulfasalazine, small or resection. And again, the blood tests are valid. The whole red blood cell folate is very good. Homocysteine is very good as a lab test. Here are some food sources, and my recommendations typically for a period of time to get back up. Magnesium is a very important one. of the minerals now. Not going to go through all this, just kind of browse through it. Quite common to be low on magnesium, good sources in the diet, but you may still need supplementation, which is a valid way to get your magnesium back up and in good status. Zinc is another very important nutrient that's commonly deficient in IBD. Causes some obvious signs that you can measure, as well as in a lab test. And here are some good sources. A lot of animal sources are very good. You may still need supplementation and for a period of time to be able to get your zinc stores back up. And then finally, electrolytes, which are neither vitamins or minerals, they're electrolytes. These are charged molecules. There's a lot of electrolyte drinks out there or supplements. If you've vomited or diarrhea or sweated a lot, you're probably low on electrolytes. There's good sources of each of these in the diet. So I actually just recommend making up your own little electrolyte drink or getting them from food. Maybe add a little honey to make it a sweet kind of a little drink. Yeah, keep an eye on electrolytes, very, very important. And try and avoid obviously off the shelf stuff because it likely has sugar and other things in it, right? It wouldn't be SCD compatible. Of course, if you're completely electrolyte deficient and cannot eat, just because something is not SCD compatible, this is very important to get your electrolytes back up. It's kind of like an emergency thing. You may have to go off SCD to get there. And for this purpose, like you just need to. You may need to go to ER and get infusion. So it's pretty critical to get your electrolytes. All right. So wrapping up, everybody, I hope I've answered a bunch of your questions of how to know how much you need and how to know whether you're over and under. Going back to this question about working with your doctor, I hope I'll be able to answer concerns they may have about weight loss and malnutrition, how you can work with them to address each of these and making sure that everybody's confident that SCD is not making you malnourished or deficient. Again, focus on everything on the higher end, even if it means supplementation or using a multi-supplement for the micronutrients. And focus on what you need, not kind of what the standard public health numbers are. Your options and your tools, well, there are lab tests, obviously, the traditional lab tests that your doctor orders. These are the ones that are, they're insurance covered and reliable and valid. Like those are, I mentioned a lot of them just a second ago. I have no problem with them. There are quite a lot of direct-to-consumer tests too. These are sort of come out of the complementary functional medicine side of the world. They're typically not covered by insurance, and so you have to pay for them. I don't recommend these. These are becoming so common and so kind of broadly used. They're not valid. They're not valid for the intended purpose to help you. They're basically a waste of your time and money in most cases. So I would not use these non-standard, non-insurance covered tests. There's a reason they're not covered. And I would be very, very cautious if somebody's making you do lots of unnecessary lab tests to measure certain nutrients or microbes in your stool. Be very careful. I just don't use them. I don't think they're valid. And let's just rely on your food intake and your assessment. You can do it at home. Monitor your weight. If you're pediatric, monitor your growth. Look for signs of deficiency. Log your foods, your journals, use trackers. These are going to be much more relevant to assessing your nutritional status. You can work with a professional to look at malnutrition assessment and put in guardrails and alarms. Like, when do you stop SCD if things are not lining up? If after a period of time, you're just continuing to lose weight or your anemia is not getting better, it's not because of SCD per se, but at some point you got to just jump in and work on something else, right? Maybe there's a better time to do SCD. So these are very, very important. Use what you can at home, work with your professionals, and do the assessments correctly. A lab test somewhere isn't going to necessarily tell you exactly what's missing. So be careful. And then supplementation as needed, and keep the supplementation real. Like you don't need a regimen of 15 or 20 or 30 supplements. Just a small handful should cover your needs. So just to wrap up, we're talking about SCD and nutritional adequacy. The team at Seattle Children's and University of Washington did an amazing research published for pediatrics. Encourage you to go download it. It's free. And they looked at 9 pediatric patients who were on SCD. They happened to be taking some supplements. You can see them here, patient 1, patient 2. And they assessed their SCD nutrient status, right? Their intake. And the conclusions were that nutrient intake in pediatric IBD patients on SCD was adequate when it was compared to their peer reference population, even though they were healthy. So it was adequate. Adequacy was variable, however, when compared to the reference intake, those charts I showed you, we know that. And so close monitoring with a multidisciplinary team while on SCD is actually recommended. So that's an important conclusion they made. Here are some charts. The kids with SCD are shown in blue, and the ones kind of the reference youth from another survey are shown in red. And these are for each of the vitamins, B1, B2, B3, C, A. So you can see that there's kind of pretty much on par across the board. If they're taking the supplements or having a really good variety of meals. Here's some more intake compared to their peers. So very, very good start, but you got to be careful. And then just to wrap up, I know we're running out of time. Just to wrap up, here are just my last page. Those 2 papers I showed you earlier. I want to thank a couple of people, Rochelle Cavanis, who helped me with some of my SCD protocol recipes, and a couple of other folks who helped with the nutrient requirements I showed you in some of those slides. Here's a link to my SCD protocol if you want to explore it and see what it's all about and how it makes SCD easier to implement. Of course, the Specific Carbohydrate Diet Association website, excellent source of additional videos, resources, instructions, and links to lots of places. And thank you again for inviting me. And then there's another source actually that more broadly talks about nutrition and IBD, not just SCD, but covers a lot of scientific talks, and it's a little bit more geared to medical community, but there's a lot of good resources there on just general diet. And hopefully you can get your GI doctor to take a peek there to become a little bit more tuned in with diet and IBD. All right. So I think I'm done. Here we go. Thanks for everybody for your attention. And I'm going to hit pause and exit out of the screen, and happy to answer your questions, everybody. Thanks for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Ali. You've covered so much. I'm not sure that there's any questions that are out there yet. So I think you covered a tremendous amount. One of the things that was coming up was my primary care doctor won't authorize testing to check my vitamin levels, except for my B12, vitamin D, folate, and folic acid. What do I do? Or is it important for me to have, have those tested, and where would I go? Or, what's your thoughts on vitamin A or vitamin E, K, things that they don't normally test for?
Yeah. Good question. Yeah, those other vitamins are typically not found to be deficient. Vitamin A is storable, so it's kind of you almost have to work to become deficient in vitamin A. And it's important. It's an important vitamin. It comes from animals. But look, if your doctor is not authorizing it, it's probably a reason. Either you don't have signs of deficiency, or the lab tests aren't really super valid. There is not necessarily a lab test for everything. I used to develop these tests. I'm a analytical chemist background, right? I used to develop these lab assays. Not everything is easy to measure, and not everything that is measurable is valid, and not everything that's measured is actionable, right? So those are pretty high standard to doing a lab test and then making a decision based on the lab results. And so that's why I made an point that just because a consumer lab test is available doesn't mean you should be coughing up some money and getting it. It's not necessarily what is going to help you, right? Oftentimes, whoever was asking this question, it's probably easier to document what you're eating on a notepad for 3 or 4 days or 5 or 7 days, listing everything you typically eat. And a professional, I'm happy to do this. Just give me the list and I can probably tease out exactly what's missing, as a gap in your diet, right? If I see no dairy in there, I'm probably going to be concerned about calcium, right? If I see no, source of iron, I'm going to say, I don't need an iron lab test. Like, let's just focus on getting some iron back in your diet, right? So it's almost easier than it sounds. Let's not make this more complicated than it is. You do have to work with somebody who kind of knows what they're doing, but let's just be more thoughtful about it, and don't fight your doctor if they're not ordering your lab test. There's probably a reason, and unless you have actual signs of deficiency, overt signs of deficiency, they're probably not going to order it. Insurance is probably not going to cover it.
Okay. I don't have any, there's no questions that came out from the audience at this time. So I'd like to thank you so much, Ali, Dr. Ali Arjomand, for your extending work and, your great presentation. I thank you so much. And it's amazing to be able to not only just have you speak as a clinician, but actually share with us your journey as well. And it's just so great that you can not only talk the talk, but you've lived it in your life, and that actually is adds so much heartwarming experience, I think, for all of us. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me, and glad to be part of this community and kind of share the knowledge and support IBD patients. You guys are all doing amazing work and educating yourself and becoming advocates for your own health. So very pleased to be here, and thanks for your attention, everybody.